The ledger was open on Samuel's desk at 7:15 in the morning, and the numbers did not add up. He had been sitting with it for 20 minutes before the lamp on the corner of the desk had even stopped flickering from the draft under the office door. The East Wing gutter repair, logged at £940 in February, appeared in the supply invoices at £610. The difference was not a rounding error. The difference was £330, which in itself might have been explainable, except that it appeared again in March under drainage maintenance, and again in April under the landscaping allocation, each time logged higher in the ledger than the actual invoice the supplier had sent. Someone had been writing numbers into the master ledger that the invoices did not support. The totals still balanced, which meant the remaining funds were going somewhere the ledger had been adjusted not to show. Samuel closed the book with 2 fingers, very carefully, as though closing it quickly might disturb something he hadn't finished reading yet. He had managed Aldermore Estate for 6 years. He knew its rhythms the way a person knows the rhythms of a house they have lived in long enough that the sound of a settling beam at 2 in the morning no longer wakes them. He knew which section of the ha-ha wall leaked after heavy rain, which of the old oaks along the East Drive had a root system that was quietly consuming the brick edging of the path, which of the suppliers would take 3 weeks to respond to an invoice query, and which would respond the same day. He knew the estate's costs to within £50 in any given month, and he knew that what he was looking at in the ledger was not a mistake. He pulled out a sheet of correspondence paper from the desk drawer and uncapped his pen. And then he sat for a moment, looking at the ceiling, before he began to write. The ownership of Aldermore was held through a legal trust administered by a London solicitor named Pierce, who had handled Samuel's appointment 6 years ago and who communicated with Samuel once a quarter about budgetary allocations and once a year about the estate's general condition. Samuel had never met the beneficial owner. He understood, in the way that people who manage things for absent principals understand, that the owner's identity was not his business. His business was the estate. The trust paid his salary and the estate's operating costs, and the board chaired by Diane Croft administered the practical decisions that fell between the solicitor's quarterly communiques. He addressed the letter to the ownership address at Pierce and Associates, the same address on every piece of formal correspondence he had ever sent. He stated the discrepancy clearly and without embellishment. He named the amounts, the months, and the invoices that did not match the ledger. He asked, in the measured language of someone who has dealt with institutional bureaucracy long enough to know what tone produces results, for a review of the maintenance fund allocation process before the next quarterly board meeting. He signed it, sealed it, and set it on the corner of the desk. He did not know, when he drove the letter to the village post office that afternoon and handed it across the counter, that Diane Croft had administrative access to the estate's general correspondence routing, and that the letter would not reach London by any road Samuel expected. What he also did not know was that 3 weeks later, when he wrote the second letter, the solicitor's forwarding system would route it directly to a private address in London that Diane could not touch. Nora Whitfield read the second letter on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, sitting at a desk in a first-floor office in Marylebone, with the window half open and the sound of traffic rising and falling outside like a tide. He had inherited Aldermore 18 months ago, when his uncle had died without a direct heir, and the estate had passed through a provision in the family trust that none of the solicitors had expected to need activating. Nora had grown up spending summer weeks at Aldermore, knowing the smell of the east garden after rain, and the sound the gravel made under the car wheels when you came up the drive too quickly. Inheriting it had not felt like an acquisition. It had felt more like being handed a responsibility he had not asked for and could not decline. He had decided, 18 months ago, not to announce himself. He had wanted to see what the estate was, undisturbed by the fact of his arrival. He had left the administrative structure intact, the board in place, the solicitor continuing as intermediary, and he had waited. The first letter had not reached him. When the second one arrived, he read it twice, then set it on the desk and looked at the window for a long moment. The letters were not angry. They were not accusatory in the way a person writes when they want to score points. They were precise and thorough, and written in the voice of someone who cared more about the estate than about appearing to care, which was a distinction Nora had learned to notice. The second letter contained something the first had not, a handwritten postscript at the bottom of the final page that read, "I am aware this letter may not reach the intended recipient. I am sending it anyway. The estate's east garden is failing and the cause is remediable, and I would like to remedy it." Nora read the postscript a third time. He picked up his telephone and called the solicitor's office. He said he would like to see the property. He said he would arrange it through a friend who knew the ground staff, so as not to cause a formal occasion. He said he preferred to arrive quietly. Pierce, who had been handling the affairs of people who preferred to arrive quietly for 30 years, made a note in his calendar and said nothing unnecessary. Samuel was in the East Garden on a Thursday morning when Ruth Paley came through the gap in the box hedge from the direction of the potting shed, followed by a man Samuel did not recognize. Ruth was the estate's head groundskeeper, a compact, deliberate woman in her 50s who had been at Aldermore for 11 years and who communicated her opinions primarily through the degree of care she applied to whatever she was doing. When she thought something was being handled correctly, she worked at her ordinary pace, which was thorough and unhurried. When she thought something was being handled incorrectly, she worked faster, with a precision that communicated her feelings more clearly than any sentence she might have constructed. She introduced the man beside her as a friend of the family who had known the estate's previous owner and wanted to see the grounds. His name, she said, was Nora. The name was unusual for a man, and Samuel registered it without reaction. What he registered more directly was the man himself, who was wearing clothes that were neither expensive nor shabby, but had the specific, unremarkable quality of someone who had not thought about them, and who looked at the East Garden with an attention that was not the attention of a casual visitor. Samuel shook his hand and offered him the same explanation he would have offered anyone who asked. The East Garden was in poor condition because the drainage renovation that had been proposed in December had not been funded, and the underfunded drainage had allowed the root zone of the central beds to remain wet through winter, and 3 of the older plantings were now showing the stress of it. Nora listened without interrupting. This was unusual enough that Samuel noticed it. Most visitors, when they asked about the gardens, wanted the picturesque version. They wanted to hear about the restoration plans and the heritage plantings and the photograph the estate had appeared in once in a county publication. They did not want the drainage figures. Nora asked how long the drainage issue had been pending. Samuel said since December, which was 5 months. Nora said, "And the cost of the repair?" Samuel said £4,200, and he had submitted the proposal in writing in January and had not received a budget authorization. Nora looked at the damaged section of the central bed for a moment, and then he looked at Samuel. "What happens to the planting if it goes another season without the repair?" Samuel said it would not survive another season. There was a pause, and Nora nodded once, and then he asked if Samuel would walk him through the rest of the grounds. Samuel walked him through all of it: the ha-ha wall and its leak, the oak root system and the brick path, the greenhouse roof that had been patched with the wrong gauge of sheet material because the correct material had not been approved. He did not abbreviate any of it. He gave this stranger the full account because it was the full account. And the full account was what was true, and Samuel's instinct was always to say the true thing to whoever was in front of him, regardless of whether that person had any power to act on it. It took 40 minutes. When they reached the gate at the north end of the formal garden, Samuel stopped and offered the only editorial he allowed himself, which was that the estate could be managed well with adequate resources, and that it currently had neither adequate resources nor a clear channel through which to request them. Nora said, "Thank you for showing me." The walk back to the house was quiet. Ruth met them at the side entrance with tea, and Nora sat with Samuel in the estate office for a few minutes, while Samuel answered a query from one of the suppliers on the phone. When he came off the call, Nora was looking at the framed plan of the estate that hung on the wall beside the window, the one that dated from 1922, and showed the original garden layout before several sections had been altered in the 50s. "The east garden was larger then," Nora said. Samuel looked at the plan. "Yes, about a third larger. The section on the right was converted to lawn in 53. There's a record of it in the estate archive if you wanted to see it." Nora turned from the plan and looked at Samuel with an expression Samuel could not quite categorize. "I'd like that," he said. Samuel found the archive folder and spread the relevant documents on the desk. Nora looked through them carefully, turning each page with the unhurried attention of someone who was not performing interest, but genuinely had it. He asked 2 more questions, both of which were specific to the estate's original drainage design, and both of which required Samuel to go to the shelf, where he kept his own supplementary notes, and find the section he had written up 3 years ago, when he had first begun to suspect the drainage in the east section was under capacity. After the second question, Samuel paused with his own notes in his hand and looked at Nora. A friend of the family who had known the estate's previous owner did not, in Samuel's experience, know to ask about original drainage design in a property they were visiting for the first time. He did not say this. He filed it in the methodical way he filed most things and continued answering the question. That evening, after Nora had left and Ruth had gone home, Samuel sat at the desk and began the third letter. He had been putting it off for a week, uncertain whether the second letter had accomplished anything. He wrote now with the knowledge that it probably had not, and that the third letter was therefore necessary, regardless of whether it produced a response. He wrote it carefully, the way he wrote everything. He named the additional discrepancies he had found since the second letter, 3 more months of adjusted figures, which brought the total amount unaccounted for in the maintenance allocation to just over £11,000 across the 5 months he could document. He attached a summary table he had prepared over 2 evenings, each line cross-referenced to the relevant invoice number. He ended the letter with the same sentence he had used in the second one, almost exactly. He was sending this because the east garden was failing and the cause was remediable, and he intended to keep sending letters until something changed. He walked the letter to the village solicitor's office himself in the morning, before 8, and asked that it be forwarded to Pierce and Associates by the solicitor's own system rather than through the estate's general post. The village solicitor, a careful woman named Mrs. Halley, looked at the envelope and then at Samuel, and said she would see to it. He did not know that Nora Whitfield was at that moment drinking coffee at the kitchen table of the estate's guest cottage, where Ruth had arranged for him to stay, reading the morning's email from his London office with a particular expression of a person who has already made a decision and is waiting for the administrative world to catch up with it. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Diane Croft had called it forward by a week, which was unusual, and had sent the agenda to the board members without copying Samuel on it, which was not unusual, but which Samuel had noticed. Diane ran the board the way certain people run things they have been given authority over, with efficiency and without consultation. She was not, in Samuel's assessment, a cruel person in any deliberate sense. She was a person who had decided at some point before Samuel's tenure began that estate managers were a category of professional whose role was to implement decisions rather than to participate in making them, and she had never revisited that assessment, regardless of what evidence presented itself. She had treated Samuel with the particular courteous condescension of someone who regards competence as a feature of a position rather than of a person, which meant that when Samuel's competence was inconvenient, it could simply be set aside. She had not told him about the board's approval of the renovation project that had diverted the maintenance funds. She had not sought his input on the budget redistribution. She had signed the authorizations herself as board chair, in the reasonable confidence that the estate manager would notice, but would not have a sufficient channel through which to make his noticing consequential. Ruth came to find Samuel on Monday afternoon, while he was measuring the ha-ha wall's leak with a section of string and a spirit level. She came through the gate in the boundary hedge and stood at the edge of the path until Samuel looked up. Her face had the expression she wore when she had done something at a pace that communicated her feelings. "I need to tell you something," she said. Samuel set down the spirit level. Ruth said she had been in the maintenance block on Friday afternoon, returning a set of keys to the board's storage cabinet, and she had stopped in the corridor outside the boardroom because she had heard Diane's voice through the door and had recognized something in the tone of it that made her stop. She recounted it plainly, in the way she recounted most things. Diane had been speaking with the board's treasurer, a man named Gerald Forsyth, and she had said in the calm, specific language of someone reporting a decision rather than proposing one, that Samuel's management of the estate had created an administrative friction that the board could not continue to accommodate, and that his tenure would not be renewed at the next quarterly review, which was now scheduled for Thursday. She had said it the way a person says something that has already been settled. Ruth looked at Samuel after she had finished. "I thought you should know," she said. "I'm sorry it took me until today." Samuel said, "Thank you, Ruth," and he meant it in the full sense, not the abbreviated one. He walked back to the office and sat at the desk, without turning on the lamp, in the late afternoon light that came grey and level through the north-facing window. 6 years of quarterly reports and maintenance schedules and supplier negotiations, and the careful documented record of everything he had ever proposed, and every proposal that had ever been declined. 6 years of the East Garden, and the oak root system, and the ha-ha wall, and the greenhouse roof. He sat with all of it in the grey light and did not perform any feeling about it, because there was nobody there to perform it for. He heard the side door of the house open, and then the sound of footsteps he recognized as not Ruth's, and then Nora appeared in the doorway of the office. Samuel looked at him for a moment. Nora looked at the unlit room and at Samuel's face, and then moved into the room without asking permission, which was the kind of small presumption that Samuel registered without objecting to, and he sat down in the chair across the desk. They sat in the half-dark for a moment without speaking. Samuel thought, in a distant way, that he ought to turn on the lamp. He did not move to do it. Nora said, "I heard about Thursday." Samuel looked at him. "Ruth?" Nora said, "Ruth." Another silence. The ledger was on the corner of the desk, closed. Samuel reached out and pulled it toward him without opening it, a movement that was mostly habitual, the way a person reaches for something familiar when the ground shifts under them. Nora reached across the desk and set his hand on the ledger, a brief, steadying gesture that covered Samuel's hand for one breath, and then withdrew. Samuel looked at the place on the ledger where Nora's hand had been. He said, "The letters aren't going to make a difference in time." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They already have." Samuel looked at him. Nora said, "I came to Aldermore because of the letters. I didn't expect to find what I found when I got here." He stopped, and then he said the rest of it with the precision of someone who does not usually say this kind of thing aloud. "I stayed because of something I didn't expect. Samuel sat with that sentence for a moment. He filed it in the same methodical way he had filed the question about the drainage design, and the question about the 1922 estate plan, and the specific way Nora had looked at the East Garden with an attention that was not the attention of a casual visitor. He said, "Who are you?" Nora looked at the window. Then he looked at Samuel. "There's a board meeting Thursday," he said. "I think you should be there." Samuel did not press it. He had learned in 6 years of managing an estate on behalf of an absent principal that some structures of authority were not his to open. He turned on the lamp. The room became warm and ordinary. Ruth knocked on the side door at 5:30, and they had tea in the kitchen, the three of them, and talked about the oak root system and the East Garden and the specific gauge of greenhouse roof material that would do the job if the funds were ever allocated. Nora listened with the same attention he had brought to everything else, and asked Ruth how long the greenhouse roof patch had been holding. Ruth said 2 years, and that it had held because she had gone out herself in November and added a second layer of sealant on her own time. Nora looked at Ruth for a moment. "Thank you for that," he said. Ruth said it was just the roof, and moved on to the question of the oak, but Samuel saw her glance sideways at Nora with a small, considered look, and he filed that too. Thursday arrived with a cold, clear morning. Samuel put on his better jacket and drove to the estate's meeting room early enough to set out his documentation before anyone else arrived, the way he always prepared for board meetings, because in 6 years he had learned that the only thing he consistently had on his side was the precision of his records. He laid out 3 separate folders. The first contained the maintenance ledger with his annotations. The second contained the original invoices, each one cross-referenced to the corresponding ledger entry with a small adhesive flag in the margin. The third was the summary table he had attached to the third letter, printed on clean paper. Diane arrived at 9 with Gerald Forsyth and 2 other board members whose names Samuel knew, a woman called Patricia Vane, who had been on the board for 4 years, and a man named Charles Aldrich who had joined the previous autumn. They arranged themselves around the table with the settled confidence of people who have already decided what the meeting is going to accomplish. Diane looked at Samuel's folders and then at Samuel with an expression of polite patience, which was the expression she used when she was waiting for a formality to conclude so that the actual business could begin. She called the meeting to order. She moved through the first 2 agenda items, which concerned the renovation project's progress and the summer calendar for the estate's public access days, with the efficient fluency of someone who had prepared those sections in detail. The third agenda item was listed. Samuel could now see from the copy Diane set in front of him as Estate Management Structure Review. He opened his first folder. Before he could speak, the door at the end of the room opened and Nora walked in, and beside him was a man Samuel recognized from 6 years of formal correspondence. Pierce, the solicitor, carrying a document case under his arm. Diane looked up. There was a moment in which the room simply held what it was holding without anyone moving. Diane's expression did not change in any visible way, except that the quality of her patience became something different, more careful, more watchful. Pierce said, in the manner of a man who has been doing this work for 30 years and has no patience for preamble, "Good morning. I should introduce my companion. This is Nora Whitfield, the beneficial owner of Aldermore Estate." Samuel heard the sentence. He looked at Nora. Nora was looking at him. Samuel thought of the East Garden. He thought of 40 minutes on the gravel path and the question about drainage design and the hand on the ledger in the grey afternoon light. He thought of, "I came to Aldermore because of the letters." He looked down at the folders on the table in front of him and then back at Nora, and something in his chest settled into a place it had apparently been trying to find for some time. Diane said, I wasn't aware that Mr. Whitfield would be attending. Pierce said that Mr. Whitfield had been attending to the estate's affairs quite closely for the past several weeks and had a number of things he wished to raise under the agenda's third item. Nora sat down. He sat in the empty chair beside Samuel, which was not the chair at the head of the table, and he set his hands flat on the table and looked at Diane with the same level, attentive regard he had brought to the East Garden. Diane's carefully arranged meeting had a chair at the head and an agenda with a third item that she had written herself, and the room had just rearranged itself in a way her agenda had not accounted for. She said, with the practiced composure of someone buying time, the board had planned to discuss the management review as a separate matter. Perhaps Mr. Whitfield would like to be briefed on the context before we proceed. Nora said, I've read all 3 letters. The room was quiet. Gerald Forsyth shifted in his chair. Patricia Vane looked at her folder. Charles Aldrich looked at the door, which was closed. Diane said, the letters represent one perspective on a complex administrative situation. Her voice was composed but had acquired a slight additional precision, the kind of precision that appears when a person is constructing each sentence as they go rather than delivering one they prepared. Nora said, Mr. Sullivan's third letter contains a documented accounting of £11,240 in maintenance funds that were logged in the master ledger at figures that do not match the supplier invoices. I'd like to understand where that discrepancy went. He quoted the amount from the third letter. He had it exactly. Diane said, the renovation project was approved by the full board in February. Nora said, the renovation project was approved. The maintenance fund redistribution that funded it was not disclosed to the estate manager, and the ledger entries that would have made it visible to him were altered. Those are 2 different things. He paused. Ruth Paley witnessed a closed-door conversation in this building in which you directed a board officer to make those adjustments. I'd like to hear her account before we proceed further with the agenda. Diane looked at Nora for a long moment. She said, this is highly irregular. Pierce said quietly that the owner of the estate had the authority to call witnesses at any administrative meeting concerning the estate's affairs, and that they had anticipated this objection, and he had the relevant trust documentation in his case if the board wished to review it. Diane looked at the document case. She looked at Nora. She looked finally at Samuel's 3 folders on the table, which she had been looking at since the beginning of the meeting with the patient expression of someone waiting for a formality to end, and which were now the most consequential objects in the room. Ruth came in 5 minutes later, having been waiting in the corridor with the specific, deliberate patience of someone who has been told to be somewhere at a time and is committed to being there. She sat down and recounted what she had heard through the boardroom door on a Friday afternoon in April. The date, the time, the 2 voices, and the specific sentences which she delivered in the same plain, factual register she used for everything, without embellishment and without interpretation. Gerald Forsyth did not look at Diane during Ruth's account. Patricia Vane wrote something in her folder. Charles Aldrich had apparently found something extremely interesting in the middle distance above the window. Diane said nothing while Ruth spoke. When Ruth finished, Diane set her own folder on the table with a movement that was very controlled and said, I acted in the interests of the estate's long-term program. Nora said, at the cost of the estate's maintenance infrastructure and without the knowledge of the person responsible for managing it. He said it without heat. He said it in the voice of someone making an observation that the record already contained, because the record did. The board's authority over operational decisions derives from the ownership trust. The trust has not delegated the authority to alter ledger records. That's a different matter entirely from program approval, and I'm sure you understand the distinction. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room waiting for someone to speak. It was the silence of a room in which the frame that had organized the last several months had been replaced by a different one, and everyone in the room except Samuel and Nora was in the process of adjusting. Diane did not collapse. She was not a person who collapsed. She straightened the folder in front of her and said, in a voice that had become quiet and careful in a way that was nothing like her opening composure, "I understand the Trust's position." She did not move to call the vote on the third agenda item. She did not say Samuel's name. The third agenda item, Estate Management Structure Review, remained on the paper in front of her and accomplished nothing. Nora looked at Samuel. "I'd like to discuss the East Garden drainage repair before we close. I understand the proposal has been pending since January." Samuel opened his second folder and found the proposal on the first page, because he had put it there deliberately. He read the relevant section aloud. £4,200. Drainage work. East Garden. Scope of repair detailed in the attached specification he had written in December when he had first identified the problem. He read it with the same care with which he had written the 3 letters, which was the same care with which he had measured the ha-ha wall's leak with a section of string and a spirit level, which was the same care with which he had done every job at Aldermore for 6 years on behalf of an owner he had never met. Nora said, "Approved." Patricia Vane seconded it. Gerald Forsyth raised his hand after a pause long enough to show that he was making a choice, which was a form of honesty Samuel gave him credit for. Charles Aldrich raised his hand without the pause. Diane said, "Seconded," in a voice that was no longer performing anything. Pierce spoke briefly after the vote. He said that in light of the trust documentation and the evidence presented, the board's administrative authority over the estate's operational budget would require formal review before the next quarter, and that the owner's office would be in contact with each board member individually. He said it with the same unhurried precision with which he had introduced Nora, and he closed his document case when he finished speaking. The meeting ended at 20 minutes past 11. The board members left in a sequence that suggested each of them preferred to reach the car park at a different time. Diane left third, behind Patricia Vane and ahead of the 2 men, and she stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked back at the room. And then she left without saying anything further. Ruth collected her coat from the chair beside the door and looked at Samuel with an expression that contained several things: a satisfaction she would not name, a question she would not ask, and a warmth she expressed by squeezing his forearm once before she walked out. Pierce shook Samuel's hand with the brisk formality of a man who has done his part and is thinking about the drive back to London, and then he was gone as well. The room was empty except for Samuel and Nora. Nora stood near the window with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking out at the estate's north lawn, where the morning light had finally come through the overcast and was moving in long, pale lines across the grass. Samuel gathered his folders and stacked them and set them back in his bag with the same methodical care he had brought them out with. He thought, in the distant way he had been thinking all morning, that he ought to say something. He was not certain what the correct thing was. He said, "You read all 3 letters." Nora turned from the window. "Yes." "The first one didn't reach you." "No." "So the second one was the one that—" "The second one," Nora said, "is what brought me here. The third one is what made me certain." He paused. "The postscript in the second letter. You wrote that you were sending it anyway." Samuel looked at him. "I wasn't sure it was going anywhere useful." "It was," Nora said. "It went somewhere useful." They stood in the empty boardroom for a moment in the light from the north window. Samuel thought of 6 years, and of the quarterly reports and the maintenance schedules, and of the 3 letters sent to an address he had never been certain reached anyone. He thought of 40 minutes on the gravel path talking about drainage to a man he had taken for an ordinary visitor. He said, "You knew the whole time." Nora said, "I knew who I was. I didn't know who you were until I came here." He said it simply, without the quality of an explanation. "I've owned properties I've never seen managed well. I hadn't expected to find something different." Samuel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "The drainage proposal has been approved. I'd like to begin the East Garden work before the end of the month, if the contractor is available." Nora looked at him, and something in his expression shifted in a way that Samuel recognized now as what it had been the whole time. A care that had been careful not to show its full shape until the moment it could be shown. "I'll be here to see it," Nora said. Samuel nodded. He picked up his bag and moved to the door, and Nora followed him, and they walked out of the boardroom and down the corridor and through the side entrance of the house into the cool morning air of Aldermore. The gravel crunched under their feet in the way that Samuel had noticed for 6 years, and he noticed it now. The north lawn was greening unevenly after the wet spring, and the old oak along the east drive had put out its first flush of leaves along the lower branches, and the east garden wall was visible at the end of the path, pale stone with moss in the joints, waiting. The contractor confirmed his availability 2 days later. Ruth cleared the beds in the east section the following Monday, working at her ordinary pace, the one that meant she thought things were being handled correctly. The drainage work began on the Wednesday of the following week and took 4 days, which was exactly what the specification had said it would take. Samuel was in the east garden on the last afternoon, checking the finished grade against his drawings, when Nora came through the gap in the box hedge. He stopped beside Samuel and looked at the turned earth and the new drainage channels, and the section of restored bed edging that the contractor had repointed while they were in. The afternoon light was low and warm, and came at a long angle from the west, the kind of light that showed the texture of stone clearly and made the new work look as though it had been there for some time. Samuel set down his drawing and stood up straight. The east garden was not finished. The damaged plantings had been cleared and the beds were bare, waiting for the restocking order that had been placed the week before and would arrive in 3 weeks. The low stone edging along the central beds was repaired, but unstained by weather yet. The whole section had the particular quality of something that was no longer failing and had not yet become itself again, the quiet that exists in the space between repair and restoration. Samuel had spent 6 years knowing this estate in that interval, the space between what it needed and what it was getting, and he had worked inside that space with the same unhurried care he would have brought to a property with unlimited resources, because that was the only way he knew to work. He looked at the restored section of the east garden, and then at Nora beside him, who was looking at the same thing. Nora said, "It's going to be good." Samuel said, "Yes." The word held everything he meant, and nothing extra. Ruth would bring the new plantings in 3 weeks, and she would set them in with the same deliberate attention she brought to every job she considered properly authorized. The greenhouse roof would be next. Then the ha-ha wall. Then the brick path along the east drive, where the oak root was patient and could be accommodated without losing the tree. There was enough work ahead that Samuel had already begun to order it in his mind, the way he had been ordering the estate's needs in his mind for 6 years. And now, for the first time, the order was connected to a resource structure that was not going to be rerouted before it reached him. He picked up his drawings from the ground where he had set them and rolled them carefully, the way he always rolled drawings, and tucked them under his arm. Nora was still looking at the garden, and Samuel looked at him for a moment in the warm and level light. And then he looked at the east garden wall, which he had known for 6 years, and which had been waiting for this particular afternoon, without knowing it was waiting. The low sun caught the moss in the joints of the stone and made it a richer green than it looked at midday, and the shadow of the box hedge fell across the bare beds in a long, clean line, and the air smelled of turned earth and the faint resin of the trimmed box, and Aldermore was quiet around them in the way it was always quiet at this hour. A quietness that was not empty but full of the particular presence of a place that has been tended. Samuel stood in it and felt it settle, the same way a house settles when the right person comes home to it. He was still there when the light finally moved off the wall,